Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Connecticut Fair Housing Center presentation of their study of mixed population housing. Last year, the state legislature commissioned a study of tenants in state-funded elderly disability housing. The Department of Housing enlisted our partners at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center to conduct that work for us. And the full report is on the Fair Housing Center's website if you would like to review it after this presentation. I would first and foremost like to thank the Fair Housing Center for their good work on this report. The Department of Housing does concur with the recommendations and the findings in this report. But what today is about is a presentation of the findings and the recommendations and a time to hear from you. What your, an opportunity for us to answer your questions and to hear your opinions and your concerns and your thoughts. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, Erin Kemple. Erin?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming on a December afternoon where it's actually pretty nice out. I really appreciate it. And thank you also to the Department of Housing for asking the center to do this work. We found that it was very interesting, and we learned a lot by doing it, and I hope you'll learn a lot by hearing about what we did. There we go. This is my contact information. We look forward to hearing your comments and any recommendations that you have, although this is labeled the final report. In fact, we are going to be incorporating what we have heard. We did a similar public hearing on Tuesday down in East Haven, a hearing yesterday up at the Legislative Office Building in Hartford, and this is our last listening session today. Mike Santoro from the Department of Housing is the one who is at everyone else, and so to spare Commissioner Klein, I'm going to keep his information up there if you want to get in touch with him to give any comments or suggestions. So as Yvonne said, this is an overview of the report. I'm going to also give an overview of our recommendations, and then we're going to hear from you. We ask that you hold your questions until I'm done with the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions and hear any information that you have. This is being taped for Darien Public Access TV, so we are going to have you speak into a mic if you have questions or if you want to ask, provide us recommendations, just so it all gets onto tape. So, to start with the background, as Yvonne said, back in 2017, the Connecticut legislature passed an act that asked that the Department of Housing look at 3 state-funded housing complexes to determine who was living in the elderly, among people who are elderly and people who are young and disabled, and to give a sense as to whether or not the perception that there was conflict among age groups was actually accurate. Because people who are young, people who are elderly is such a mouthful, we're referring to this housing as mixed population housing, and what it really means is mixed age population. There are no families with children in this because they don't necessarily qualify, and you'll hear about why, but it is affordable housing, and you'll hear more about that. So one of the things that SA 1719 required is that we consult with the Housing Committee of the General Assembly to choose 3 state-funded complexes, and based upon the recommendations of the Housing Committee, Commissioner Klein chose the Brookfield Housing Authority, the Manchester Housing Authority, and the Wallingford Housing Authority. One issue that has come up in previous presentations is why didn't we pick housing from one of the major urban areas like Hartford or Bridgeport, because there is no state-funded mixed population housing in those urban areas. There may be federally funded mixed population, but because the state of Connecticut cannot make changes to federal housing or federal housing policy, it was deliberately left out of the statute and deliberately not included as part of this study. And as you heard Commissioner Klein say, the Department of Housing ultimately asked the Connecticut Fair Housing to perform the work. So what we did is we obtained data from the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. They are the agency that manages the state funded housing portfolio. We requested information regarding state mixed population housing only, not, as I said, the federal housing. And according to the regulation, we asked them to give us information by age, income, and rent payments. That's all the information they have, as well as information on waiting lists. They do not have a lot more in-depth information other than that. So we then went to the housing authorities who agreed to participate. We asked them to both confirm and correct the information that was provided by CHFA. But in addition to that, we asked them for information about the race and national origin of the tenants who lived in their complexes to see if that played a role in this perception that there was conflict between the age groups. We asked for information about gender for the same reason. Under the requirements of the law, we were also told to ask about evictions and use of municipal services by tenants and information about the work of the resident service coordinators. In addition to requesting information from the housing authorities and from CHFA, we also attended a meeting of the resident service coordinators. There were about 25 resident service coordinators at that meeting, and they worked throughout the state of Connecticut, but the majority worked in mixed population housing. So they were really what we felt were the experts on some of the issues that tenants are seeing in mixed population housing. Probably one of the most significant things we were able to do is to look at a 2004 report that was put out by the Legislative Program Review and Investigations Committee called Mixed Populations in State Elderly Disabled Housing. It's far more in depth than what SA 1719 asked us to do. It has a lot more information, and I recommend that if this is a topic that you're interested in, that you go back and really take a look at that. The report is on our website. It's also referred to in the report that you have today so that you can get a hold of it if you want to. The information that we requested from the resident service coordinators, for those of you who don't know, resident service coordinators are a statutory creation. It is money and a program that is administered by the Department of Housing, and it really asks that the Department of Housing use the money that it is given in order to place what are essentially social workers at different public housing complexes that the state has money for. Not every housing authority has resident service coordinators because there isn't enough money allocated for that. So what we asked of the resident service coordinators is what were the support services that they provided, what were the gaps in support services, and what were the recommendations for additional support services. So then we stopped and looked at what was the housing complex looked at. And one of the things that I learned that I didn't know, even though I've been doing this for a long time, is that people who are young and disabled have been eligible to live in mixed population housing since the 1960s. However, until the 1980s, the majority of people who were living in mixed population housing were elderly. So there were very few people who were young and disabled living in mixed population until about the mid-80s, and at that time, there was a growth in assisted living services so that people could stay in their homes. So for instance, if someone was elderly and they could no longer go down into the basement to do laundry, that was one of the things that might precipitate them moving into mixed population housing. But with the growth of assisted living services where people will come in and assist you, people didn't necessarily need to leave their long-time homes. And so the number of people who wanted to get into mixed population housing, at least the elderly people who wanted to move in, started to drop. At the same time, the people who were young and disabled who started to be deinstitutionalized, and so their need for affordable housing grew, and since they were already eligible for mixed population housing, the number of people who were applying to mixed population housing started to go up. As a result, more people who were young and disabled, starting in the mid-1980s, started to be admitted into this mixed population housing, and it began to be truly mixed, as opposed to mostly 100% people who were elderly. So that's what we know about the program. The question is, who actually needs mixed population housing? So one of the things that you may not know is that Connecticut is the 7th oldest state in the country. 14% of its population is over the age of 65, and between 2010 and 2025, the population of people 65 and older will grow by 54.5% until it reaches 21%. So if you want, I like to see things visually. This is what it looks like. So the bottom that's white, that is the people who are between 0 and 18. The blue is the number of people between 19 and 64, and the gray is the ages between 65 and older. And you can see that in 2010 it was 14%, then to 16%. Pretty soon we're going to be at 18%, and it's projected that that population will be 21% by 2025, which is not that long from now. But people who are young and disabled are also increasing. So 11.1% of the people between 18 and 64 have a disability. Remember, in order to qualify for mixed population housing, you either have to be elderly over the age of 65 or younger than 65 and disabled. You can't just qualify because you're younger than 65. So 11.1% of the people between 18 and 64 have a disability, and between 2010 and 2018, Connecticut residents between the ages of 18 and 64 had a 3.17% increase in the number of people with a disability. Whereas between those same years, Connecticut residents over 65 with a disability only had a 20.25% increase in the number of people. So there was a much smaller increase in the number of people with a disability who were young and disabled than people who were elderly and disabled. This is what it looks like on a chart. The very last row, the 2018 chart, shows 11.17% of the people 18 to 64 are disabled, 31.65 over 65 are people with disabilities who are over 65. Again, remember that in order to qualify for mixed population housing, you have to have two characteristics. Either you are young and disabled, or you're elderly, but you also have to be income eligible. And one of the things we found by looking at income eligibility is that people who are young and disabled have 4 times the number of people living below the poverty level compared to people who are elderly. So that's what it looks like. So percentage of people living below the poverty level, 18 to 64, is 5%. The percentage of people living below the poverty level over age 65 is only 1%. So there's 4 times the number of people over the age of 65, between 18 and 64 who are living below the poverty level. And this is what it looks like on a pie chart, because one of the things I was wondering is if we added disability and income together, would that show, what would that show in terms of the need? And that orange, the orange triangle, not the kind of burnt yellow triangle, but the orange triangle shows that 11.17% of the people who are young and disabled live below the poverty level, as opposed to only 4% of people who are elderly and disabled who live below the poverty level. Again, there's a much greater need for people who are young and disabled for affordable housing, which is what mixed population housing is. We next spent some time looking at who is actually living in mixed population housing today. There are 6,451 units of mixed population housing subsidized by the state. That translates into 182 buildings managed by 96 housing authorities. The largest mixed population building is in New London with 130 units, and the smallest is in Mansfield with 10 units. The average number of units managed is 78. This gives you a sense of the housing authorities that participated, about 4% of the of the mixed population housing units were part of this study. You'll see that 64,000 or 6,400 units. At the top, the Brookfield Housing Authority manages 35 units. The Manchester Housing Authority manages 80 units, and the Wallingford Housing Authority manages 155. So one of the things that the Housing Committee wanted was a housing authority that had very few, one that had a lot, and one in the middle, and that's where we ended up. So one of the things we found is that the majority of units are efficiencies, and one of the people who was at the meeting yesterday wanted to know what efficiency was. Studio apartment efficiency, they're all the same. It's one room. Maybe there's a piece set off for the kitchen. There's a bathroom, but it's all in one room. 37% of the mixed population housing are one bedrooms, and that is starting to change. One of the things the state of Connecticut has done is made rehabilitation funds available for this housing, and I know that Darien Housing Authority right now is changing the configuration of one of their elderly population, mixed population units to increase the number of one bedrooms. A result of the size of the units, the most units are occupied by one or at most two people, and the CHFA estimates that the total number of people living in mixed population housing is 7,346. This is just a sense. You'll see the Manchester Housing Authority has the majority of its units, far in excess of anybody else, with 95% of their units as efficiencies. The Wallingford Housing Authority has 59%, while the BHA, the Brookfield Housing Authority, only has 77%. But as you can see, it does conform to what we've seen, which is the majority of those units are efficiencies. One of the things we wanted to know is what was the age of people living in mixed population housing, and in fact, one of the recommendations of the 2004 report was that the state of Connecticut change its eligibility for mixed population housing and limit the number of people who are young and disabled to just 13.5% of the people living in mixed population housing. That's the way it is in Massachusetts, 86.5% elderly. You can see that that did not happen. That change did not occur. There is right now no requirement about the percentage of people living in mixed population housing by age. So as you can see, though, that the way it has actually shaken out in Connecticut, the median age of people living in mixed population housing, state-run mixed population housing, is at 83% elderly and 17% young and disabled. So one of the other things we wanted to see is who's on the waiting list. And so even though people who are young and disabled have more than 3 times the need for affordable housing, when compared to people who are elderly, there are more people on the waiting list who are elderly than people who are young and disabled on the mixed population. And this is what it looks like. So the first 2 columns talks about who is actually living in the units, and then the last 2 columns are about who is on the waiting list, and you can see that statewide, 59% of the people on the waiting list are elderly, 41% statewide are young and disabled. That varies by housing authority, with the Manchester Housing Authority and the Wallingford Housing Authority both having fewer people who are elderly on the waiting list than people who are young and disabled. As I said, the Special Act 1719 did not require that race or national origin be included in the report, but one of the things we wondered is if race and national origin of tenant population had an effect on whether or not there was conflict or perceived conflict. And so CHFA does not have access to that information. Apparently, it's not something that you're required to report. But we asked the people who were participating in the study to give us that. And what we found is that the majority of people living in mixed population housing that was studied are white, regardless of age or disability. The most diverse group are people who are young and disabled, but really there isn't a lot of diversity. It's still the majority of people living in mixed population housing does not reflect the diversity of Connecticut. And one of the reasons for that is the age of people. So 87% of people over the age of 64 are white, 13% are people of color. So by definition, the people who are going to qualify as elderly are overwhelmingly white. The number of people who are young and disabled, just young, between the ages of 25 and 64, are 72% white and 28% people of color. So there is more diversity in the younger population. This is what it actually looks like. What you can see is, for instance, there's no one who is elderly and black living in any of the housing complexes studied. With regards to people of color, young, disabled, and black, there's 4. Young, disabled, and Latino, there's 12. Young, disabled, and Asian, there's 0. So the most diversity, as I said, comes in the young disabled population, with very few people in the people of color at all. And we were wondering why that was. We were trying to figure out, was it just the statistics of the demographics? And one of the things that it occurred to us is that in 2014, HUD put out a memo that said when using criminal records to screen tenants, that criminal record tends to screen out more people of color than people who are white, because people of color are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated at disproportionate rates to their presence in the population. So if people are being disqualified without more, simply because of their criminal record, that would tend to skew the population more than white. But we don't actually know if that's true without actually looking at the tenant selection policies of a lot of housing authorities. The other thing that we thought is that Matthew Desmond, in his book Evicted, documented that the majority of people who are evicted are people of color. So if a housing authority is eliminating or having people not qualify without more, because they have an eviction record, that could also skew the population more toward people who are white, simply because that population tends to have an eviction record. We don't know, again, if that's true without looking at the tenant selection policies, and I do know that some of the housing authorities in the room are doing more than just looking at whether or not someone has an eviction record. They're actually doing a case-by-case analysis. We also went and asked the housing authorities who participated if they could give us information about the gender of the people living in the complex. We don't have it from all the mixed population housing. And one of the things that was a surprise to me is that only a slight majority of people living in mixed population housing are women. I really thought it would have been the vast majority, because my stereotype is that women outlive men. But certainly with regards to mixed population housing, that wasn't true. And there were more men than women in the young disabled category, which was a surprise. This is what it actually looks like. You can see that males come out to 128, women is 136, so there's about a 12, or not even 8 or so, I don't know, my math is bad, number difference, so it's not a huge difference between the actual number of men and the actual number of women. But again, the number of young disabled men, 63, is higher than the number of young disabled women. And we were wondering why that was. And one of the things that we thought is that since most units are efficiencies or one bedrooms, and 78.5% of women had single parent households, women who are young and disabled are more likely to have children than not, and they would really not qualify for this type of housing because it wouldn't be big enough for their family. So that could be one reason why women who are young and disabled are not living in mixed population housing. We were also asked to look at financial information, because that's one of the things that the housing authorities who manage this housing are saying, is that they get very little money from the state of Connecticut. That's the way the program was set up. It was set up so that, for the most part, rents are what supplies the income to manage this. And one of the things the housing authorities have been saying is that by mixing the populations, that has an effect on the income. So let me walk you through that. So again, the majority, rental income pays the majority of the costs in state-funded mixed population housing. There is a program called the ERAP program, or Elderly Rental Assistance Program. It's an in-place rental assistance program, which means that you can't take your RAP certificate with you and move someplace else. It goes with the unit, but the bad part about the program is that it's a dying program. So if I move out of a unit that is subsidized with elderly rental assistance, the person who moves into my unit, even if they are elderly, does not get that subsidy. It's one of the cost savings measures that has been put in place over the years, and it's a cost saving measure that is really having an impact on people who are young, who are living in mixed population, as well as the housing authorities that are trying to manage this housing. Calculation of the actual amount of the rent, called the base rent, is difficult and hard to understand. I had a really hard time with it because it depends upon several factors like the utilities, the amount of funds received from the state, and a whole bunch of other factors that I probably am leaving out. But the 2004 Mixed Populations Report concluded that the increasing number of residents who are young and disabled has a negative impact on the income to the housing authorities. And the reason for that is that tenants who are young and disabled tend to have lower income and as a result pay less rent. To try to address this, CHFA has recommended that housing authorities use rent stratification, which means that there are multiple base rents as a way of trying to increase their income. But by increasing base rent, that may mean that more people who are young and disabled could be disqualified because they are lower income. One of the other things that somebody at the Tuesday forum mentioned is that it could also have a negative effect on women who are elderly in particular because they did not tend to work in professions that had a pension that would be high enough for them to pay an increased base rent. But that's all speculation. We actually don't know that. And one of the things that we are recommending is that rent stratification be studied more and before it be actually determined that if it's useful or not. So this represents the percentage of rent paid by age. The tall blue bands are the percentages paid by people who are elderly. The small orange bands are paid, is the percentage paid by people who are young and disabled, and you can see the discrepancy. Now, the whole reason for all of this is because there is a perception that there is a lot of conflict in mixed population housing, and that the victims of that conflict, for the most part, are people who are elderly. And so that is really where we went with all of this, is to determine if tenant behavior was caused by people who are elderly or people who are young and disabled or whatever. So in order to get at that issue, the Special Act 1719 asked us to look at evictions and summary process judgments. So to be clear, evictions means you get a notice to quit or you get some kind of court paper telling you that an eviction has begun. Summary process judgment means that the case has gone to court and all the way through to judgment. And one of the things that they wanted us to look at is who actually had a judgment against them and what was the reason. Didn't get a lot of information. You'll see that the Brookfield Housing Authority has not evicted anyone in the past 2 years, and actually we have access to the judicial eviction information, and we actually went back 5 years. Brookfield Housing Authority hasn't evicted anyone, brought a case in court that went to judgment in the last 5 years. The largest was the Wallingford Housing Authority. They had 12, and the number of people evicted between young and disabled was pretty even. The Manchester Housing Authority had only 4 cases go to judgment, and all of those were people who were young and disabled. And in every single case where a summary process case went all the way through to judgment, the Housing Authority got possession. But because the numbers are so small in relation to the number of people living in those units, we didn't think that this was necessarily telling us anything, except that it is clear that the housing authorities are not using eviction as a way of, for lack of a better word, controlling tenant behavior. We were asked to get information about use of municipal services by people who are elderly and people who are young and disabled. We weren't able to get that information because everybody that we contacted said it was private, except for, I understand, in either Guilford or one other municipality, they will give it to you when you walk into the police station, but since they weren't involved in the study, I didn't get that. I think the most valuable information we got was the input from the resident service coordinators. I attended a meeting with probably 25 resident service coordinators, and they are in housing every day, dealing with tenants on a daily basis. So when I asked them what were the services that they provided, what they said was assistance in getting services, assisting tenants in getting any kind of service that they need, as well as public benefits, working with the tenant council, reading letters and notices for tenants who could not understand them either for cognitive reasons or language reasons, helping tenants prepare for extermination, preventing utility shutoff, connecting to family in order to coordinate services, eviction prevention services. Again, it would be interesting to see if on a statewide basis the number of evictions from state public housing, state mixed population housing was lower, where there were resident service coordinators. Assistance with conservatorship applications, maintaining contact with outside case managers and support, mediating disputes, planning and facilitating site-based events, reporting abuse, and translation for people whose first language is not English. When asked, they reported that they spent similar amounts of time with people who are elderly and people who are young and disabled. They did not think that one age population or the other was dominating in their caseload or in the work that they needed to do. And there was also no consensus on whether conflicts were initiated by people who are elderly or people who were young and disabled. They were not willing to say, everybody said that they had seen both. That they had seen times when the person who was elderly was the aggressor and people who were young and disabled were the aggressor, but they couldn't say it was always one way or even majority one way or the other. We did get a list of descriptions of conflicts from the Wallingford Housing Authority, and it was clear from reading that there was no one group was the aggressor against the other. And there was no consensus on whether conflicts between tenants of similar ages or tenants of different ages was the issue. With regards to gaps in services, one of the most interesting things that I heard is that they were unable to do planning for the next stage of a tenant's life. So for the most part, people often will move on from mixed population housing into either a nursing home or a place with more assistance, but that kind of planning usually got done in a crisis situation when there was a health problem and not in any planned way. That they would like to spend more time facilitating communication between populations, and they felt that this could happen if there was a wider variety of services that were programmed. But they're prevented from doing that by not having money enough money for programming and not having enough time. The last three, everyone agreed on these, which is that there was really a lack of state-funded homemaking assistance and Unsign health services for people who are young and disabled. So while you could get a doctor to come in and see somebody who is elderly, or you could get, for instance, homemaking services for someone who is elderly, that was very difficult to do for people who are young and disabled. They felt that there was really a lack of social services for people who were young and disabled, and there was a lack of a statewide department for that dealt with people who were young and disabled. So the Agency on Aging really deals with or tries to coordinate a whole lot of issues that are experienced by people in the elderly population, and there isn't anything similar for people who are young and disabled. So Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services may deal with people who have mental health services, rehabilitation services may deal with people who have a physical disability, but there's not really any one department or any one agency that's coordinating any kind, all the services that people might need. When I asked the resident service coordinators what caused conflicts between tenants, the universal answer was undiagnosed and untreated mental illness and addiction. That there was a lot, both populations had undiagnosed mental illness and addiction issues, and that the problems have gotten worse with cuts in the budget for mental health and addiction services. And so where they may have been able to get services for someone before, they are now not able to get services. At the hearing yesterday, one of the things I heard is that there is a perception that people who are difficult for one reason or another have a mental health or addiction issue when they may just be difficult people. But I think that the residents service coordinators acknowledged that when they said they didn't have enough time to do programming, they didn't have enough time to facilitate communication. And so I think they were saying, yes, there are probably people who don't have a mental health or addiction issue who I would like to be able to spend more time figuring out why they're always complaining about fill in the blank, but that they don't have enough time to do that. The recommendations as a result of the report were to review tenant screening and selection policies to ensure that they're not keeping people of color out, to research the effect of rent stratification on the eligibility of tenants who are young and disabled, as well as people who are elderly, research the effect of rent stratification to determine if the amount of increased rent is actually worth what may happen to the eligibility of people, and provide, this was something the resident service coordinators wanted, which was additional training on a variety of issues so that they could do their job better. They also suggested that there be enhanced collaboration between social service agencies, which would include not just the resident service coordinators, but the management of housing authorities and the management of social service agencies. So too often what the resident service coordinators saw is that they could make a connection with this person who worked at this social service agency, but once this resident service coordinator or this person at this social service agency left, there was then no other way for the new people coming in to have those same kinds of relationships. The other thing that they recommended is resident education and awareness on disability issues. So one of the things we heard on Tuesday and yesterday was that when someone who is young and disabled doesn't have, this was something that was brought up by people in the audience, doesn't have an obvious disability, for instance, they're not in a wheelchair, or they don't have a seeing eye dog, for instance, that there is the perception that the person who is young and disabled is scamming in order to be there. And so education, and that any kind of bad behavior is voluntary. So it's not that I have a disability that makes me act in a certain way, it's that I'm doing it on purpose. And so one of the things the resident services coordinators recommended, that there be actual education for the residents themselves. The recommendations for the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, for the Department of Developmental Services, and the Department of Social Services is to determine if there are enhanced services that can be provided to people who are young and disabled. And the recommendations for the Department of Housing is to request increased funding for resident service coordinators so that all housing authorities managing mixed population housing have access to a resident service coordinator. That's not the case now. And to continue prioritizing the creation, and I would say rehabilitation of mixed population housing. One of the things that Mike Santoro said from Department of Housing when he was here on Tuesday was that, in fact, what Department of Housing is doing is trying to increase the number of non-income age-restricted housing. So housing in which any population could live there. People who are elderly, people who have children, people who are young and disabled. That is what the Department of Housing is particularly interested in creating and supporting at this time. And certainly in light of the affordable housing crisis, especially here in Fairfield County, we would support that. So, questions? Let me just get you a mic just so you can be on tape.
Hi, great presentation. My name is Beatrix Winter with the Norwalk Senior Center. My question is, will this presentation be available online for us to print out?
It will be on our website, and if you registered for today's training, you will get an email that gives you the presentation, the report, and the appendices to the report.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Questions? Suggestions? Recommendations? People in East Haven had a lot to say.
Thank you. Thanks for this presentation, too. What I have to say isn't going to surprise you, but even outside of state-funded housing, where there's mixed populations, for example, in Norwalk, where I'm the fair housing officer, there's an organization called STAR, which serves the needs of developmentally disabled adults, many of whom have some kind of housing subsidy, a Section 8 voucher of some kind, who go out and live in a mixed population condo, for example, or apartment building. And several times it's come to light that when the neighbors figure out that there's a person with an intellectual disability, I get a phone call about how they shouldn't be living with normal people because we have a societal tendency to have a discriminatory animus to people with intellectual disabilities. I think we don't even recognize it, for the most part, as a discriminatory animus. In one case I'm thinking of, they said, well, what would this person do if there was a fire? So STAR, of course, did trainings with their tenants and offered to train any of the other people who lived in that condo, none of whom wanted to take advantage of that training. So I think it's really important because we also see a tendency in public housings, at least locally, to segregate not to have mixed population housing, but to move towards having, senior only and disabled only, which I think is a significant fair housing issue. So I'm glad that the state is moving towards continuing to emphasize mixed populations, and I think it's great to include families with children, especially with elderly. We see that as a wonderful combination, again, in private housing. There's the Marvin in Norwalk, which combines a daycare with elderly housing so that the generations are mixed together. So I just wanted to say that I'm really glad that the state of Connecticut is moving in a direction to increase integration of these various populations rather than decrease.
Thank you. So one of the things that was said to me after the meeting presentation yesterday was not said on tape was, well, people who are young and disabled have different taste in music and stay up later than people who are elderly, and that's why these populations should not be mixed. And I guess one of my questions one of the questions I put to the person was, if you live in private housing, certainly next door to me, there's kids who are really young, and on the other side, there are people who are older, and I can't tell the kids who are listening to music outside, at a reasonable hour, not to do that. And I think one of the things that is concerning, and I think in addition to segregation of populations, one of the things that's concerning is that the idea that there is a way to live in any place that doesn't have any clash of lifestyles unless everything is completely segregated. So we only have people who like hip hop and stay up until, 2 in the morning, live with people who have, that's just not in the real world. And so I think one of the things that I was very to see here is that the people who are in the housing every day, whether it's mixed population or family housing or mixed population and family housing or whatever, regardless, they are the people who are saying, yes, this is possible. This is a way for people, for housing to be provided to people who need it. Questions, comments? Yes.
Name's Kras Carlucci. I'm with the Norwalk Housing Authority. So we have two sites. We have one site that's officially mixed population, and we have another site that was grandfathered. And what I have found is that a lot of the issues I see, because I do deal with a lot of the resident issues, is that because there's such a lack of services for our residents who have mental health issues, and a lot of them many times for various reasons maybe stop taking their medication, it does become a pretty scary conflict between those individuals and the seniors. As a matter of fact, I had one this morning. So I think it's really key that people who are having mental health issues are provided more services, because we do see that clash all the time, regardless of what other housing authorities see. We do see that individuals with mental health issues and seniors who are housed together many times do have conflicts, sometimes scary ones.
But I guess one of the things I wonder is, in terms of the people who have gone off their meds or who are somehow threatening, it may be the people who are elderly that feel the most threatened, but isn't everyone in that complex, both people who are young and disabled and people who are elderly? And so one of the things that I am concerned about, and one of the reasons that this was done, is because every year during the legislative session, there is always proposed language that we kick people who are young and disabled out of mixed population housing. And I guess one of the things that I continue to believe is that we can't do that because of the statistics that I just showed you having to do with need, but that it doesn't solve the problem. We need services. And yes. And, we're still in a time of economic austerity as far as the state government goes. I'm hoping that the new Lamont administration really will get Connecticut back to work and increase revenue, but it's not going to happen overnight, and we're going to continue to confront these issues for a while.
Erin, first of all, great job. You did a great job. It's a great study. Keeps the conversation going. I echo my colleagues here at the Norwalk Housing Authority. I'm Carol Martin. I represent Fairfield and Westport Housing Authorities, and echo the fact that resident services, on-site services, day in and day out, really improve quality of life for all residents, regardless of age and disability. So I agree. I hope the Lamont administration recognizes that. It's a huge commitment. We certainly worry about the bricks and mortars, but most importantly, the services are really what makes it work. The second thing I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if it came up with my colleagues in Manchester or Wallingford or Brookfield, but you had a couple of slides regarding, the issuance of the notice to quit and evictions. And I'd like to know if you could comment if it came up, because I know many times, and I've worked for other housing authorities in urban centers as well, both New Haven and New Britain. A lot of times we'll use the court system to get the court to order folks to attend some sort of structured outpatient or inpatient program because the landlords don't have the power. And so I just, I understand eviction and judgments are made, but most of the time, a professionally managed housing authority, when they're taking an action to bring a resident into court, it's because they've expended every other, and they're trying to keep the person housed and safe. So I'm wondering if you could just comment if you had any discussions with my colleagues about that.
So Wallingford Housing Authority said that, and I think they had the highest, no, I can't remember. And it was the Wallingford Housing Authority that had the highest number of cases filed, which was 12. We're not talking a huge number. And they did say that they were using it not because they wanted the person out, but because they saw it as a way to get the attention of other services. And certainly that has been something. Take out mixed population housing, talk just housing authorities. Housing authorities have had to use that at times in order to be able to get the attention of social services, get somebody on a priority list for a different kind of doctor or something else. And so that is my impression, at least from Wallingford and Manchester. Brookfield hadn't done it at all. But the other thing that came up was apparently CHFA now has someone who is in charge of working with the resident service coordinators on their staff. She is putting together a training with folks from Massachusetts, and this was a program that was just beginning when I left there in 2003, where instead of having to file an eviction case in order to get priority, there was a way you could refer to this program because the person was going to be evicted if something didn't change. And so you didn't end up, because there was always the fear that you send the notice to quit, people are going to throw up their hands and their family's going to move them out the next day, when all you're really trying to do is to get somebody's attention. And so if there are any resident service coordinators in the room, keep in touch with CHFA and with CARSH, the Connecticut Area Residential Service Coordinators and Housing Group, because they're putting together that, and I would love to see that program come to Connecticut. It doesn't take money, it just takes a lot of coordination.
Hi, I'm Holly from Bristol Housing. Great presentation, Erin. I really enjoyed it. I just have one quick question. We're talking about the race of the people in public housing or housing in the state.
Mixed population.
Mixed population. I'm sorry, mixed population. It states in here a lot about the percentage, but do we have a breakdown of the population in Connecticut overall? The race and the disabilities and the aged? Because I didn't see this in the pamphlet, and I don't think I missed it, but maybe I did.
No, you didn't. So, in general, Connecticut is 72% white, 13% African American, 8 or 7%, I can't remember, Latino, and the rest is Asian and other population. That is the total population. When you break it out by age, it's very, very different. So as you saw, when I put the numbers up, the number of people who are between the ages of 64 and, or 18 and 64, far higher number of people of color in that age group than in the age group 65 and older. And if you want more information on that, there's this thing called the Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice, which has all the stats in Connecticut. And of course, as you know, we're doing a census in 2020, and that will have the most up-to-date information. But Connecticut does remain majority white. It also remains very, very segregated. So this area, the Stamford-Norwalk area, is the what was I just looking, 7th most segregated area in the country. When you look at white Latino segregation, Hartford ranks number 8, and all the cities and towns in Connecticut rank in the top 10% of most segregated when you're looking at white-black segregation. New England tends to be much more segregated than the rest of the country, which is a surprise to many of us, was a surprise to me. I think of the South as having a problem with segregation. They are far less segregated than Connecticut. In fact, let's see, what's the statistic? 65% of people of color live in just 8 cities and towns in Connecticut. Very small. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, one more suggestion. In the mixed population and the, I've often gotten complaints from elderly people that they felt threatened or they were afraid. And when you dig a little deeper, it's not from anything in particular that this person did. It's just their default, you know, because of a mental health issue. They recognize somebody maybe is, you know, has some kind of mental health issue, and they're afraid of the person, which we see generically, but they report it as, I'm threatened, I'm afraid, without anything having actually happened. So I feel like a suggestion, obviously this takes money, but there needs to be training within these housing providers within the sites themselves
Right.
for the elderly, so that we can try to, get to a point where there's more of an understanding that someone has a mental health issue that's either apparent or not apparent, like you mentioned before, and that in and of itself is not threatening.
Right.
Hi, thank you for all the information. My name's Phoebe, and I work at Town of Wilton Social Services. And this is more of just a suggestion, and obviously everything that we're talking about requires funding. But I run into quite a few situations in this role, and I previously worked at a homeless shelter. We need to think about having some two-bedroom mixed population housing, so that we're not leaving out the moms with children with disabilities, the dads with children with disabilities, the young disabled adults who need a caregiver who do not qualify for DDS services, elderly siblings that don't want to share a bedroom, but one takes care of the other. There are just a lot more diverse family and caregiving situations that just cannot be accommodated in efficiency in one-bedroom apartments. So I know everyone's on the same page with that, most likely, but
No one else has said that, though, and that's a very interesting, everybody else has said there needs to be different living situations, but no one has actually said it that way, so I do thank you for giving that perspective, especially because I think as our populations age, there are going to be siblings or maybe an adult child and an adult, a parent living together. So thank you for mentioning
And I actually have one case that's a young adult disabled person, non-DDS eligible, with a disabled parent. So that's the kind of situation where they still need to be with each other. But a lot of these housing, none of them will accommodate a two-bedroom.
Right.
And then also, for moms with, if anyone has a suggestion, let me know.
So I'm going to let you answer, and then I'll add what I wanted to add. Jessica, over here.
Norwalk was one of the few housing authorities that was fortunate enough to receive what HUD just put out as what they're calling mainstream vouchers. And mainstream vouchers are vouchers that are to be given to young disabled individual, as long as there's one member of the family that's young and disabled, they would qualify for the voucher. So it doesn't matter if it's 3 people or 5 people, the composition of the household. So that's really a great thing. We received 19, and I'm hoping that other housing authorities got them too, because that's very helpful, and people have been just calling like crazy.
But that would go to private housing. It's just like a housing choice voucher. It's not the complex. It's not a hard unit. That's the word I'm looking for. Right. Oh, so that's another piece of it, is that it is case managed. Thank you all very much for coming. I will be here for a few minutes. I have copies of my card with me, I hope. Thank you very much. You'll see the actual, we'll be revising the report to include the comments that we've received and the suggestions that we've received. So thank you, and please take food and water. And have a great holiday season.